Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is lecture 21 in the history series, Big North American World Art History Survey Textbooks. I'm going to introduce the textbooks first, and then I'm going to talk about the way that they tend to alternate between Western and non-Western art in big blocks of chapters. They have a strange arrangement that wasn't present in earlier art history texts. Then about the way that the chapters often lack transitions, so there isn't really a story that you could read all the way through from beginning to end. Usually they're not used that way, of course. They're used, you get assigned a chapter here and a chapter there. But these books, unlike previous books, don't have a single narrative. The fourth topic there is to do with the writing tone. These books are very neutral and very careful to avoid judgment and not to praise anything too much and not to criticize anything. So I'm going to talk about consequences of that unusual tone at the end. After the Second World War, most one-volume world art history textbooks have been produced in North America and some in the UK. Here are some of them. Helen Gardner's Art Through the Ages is the most popular one in art schools and academies. Marilyn Stockstead and Michael Cothran's book is also often used in art schools. Horst Janssen's History of Art is used mostly in universities. In my experience, people who study history of art in universities often don't know about Gardner or Stockstead and assume that the whole world uses Janssen, and the other way around, it's also true. And there's a couple others there. I think at any given time there's maybe 8 or 10 of these in print, but I'm just going to take the first 3 as my examples: Gardner, Stockstead, Janssen. All these textbooks express American values, values of the United States, not even just North American, but specifically American values. There's an ambition to be international or multicultural, that is a desire to represent the entire world equally. There's an interest in diversity and inclusion, and these books get larger and larger in each edition because of that interest. And then there's the question of the writing tone. They have a calm, neutral tone that's not present, that's not often present in earlier texts. So I'm going to focus on 3 issues in particular. First of all, the problems that these texts have in integrating or arranging Western and non-Western art. Second, the lack of a continuous narrative, the fact that you can't read these books straight through. And third, the tone, the neutral, non-judgmental tone. The earlier world histories, the ones that were written in German, they didn't have the problem of integrating European art with art of other cultures, and that's because they put all their non-Western material first. And that was a reasonable thing to do because from the perspective of those authors, European art was the most important art, took up the most space, so they could put everything else before it as a kind of curtain raiser. But these post-war American and UK textbooks do have this problem because they've grown, they have a lot more space allotted to art in general, and especially to cultures outside Europe, meaning that they can't sequester all the non-Western art in just one place. They have to weave in and out of it as they go along. I'm going to take the table of contents in Stockstad's book as an example of this. So the book begins with prehistory. You see chapter 1 at the top there. It might be a little bit small to make out, but anyway, it's chapter 1. There's ancient Egypt and Greece and Roman art, Christian art, and so on. The last 2 chapters there are interesting, Byzantine art and Islamic art. Those 2 in particular are traditionally at one and the same time part of the standard narrative of art in a Eurocentric way, in a Eurocentric sense, and also not part of that, because both of them are ambiguously part of Europe and part of the Middle East. Art history textbooks that are more explicitly about European art or about Western art, books with titles like Western art, that kind of thing, usually exclude Islamic art because Islamic art is one of the ways that Europe defines itself as what it's not. It's not Islamic. But Byzantine art is almost always included. The 2 of them together like this are a sign that this is going to be an inclusive textbook. And when you see them like this, often there's going to be material that has material about cultures that are farther away from Europe, and that's exactly what happens. Stockstad uses these two as a kind of a gateway to a block of 5 chapters that are about non-Western art. So here's chapter 10, Art of South and Southeast Asia before 1200, 11, Chinese and Korean art, 12, Japanese art, 13, Art of the Americas, 14, Arts of Africa in the 16th century. There's a couple things to notice about this block of non-Western themes. First of all of them start early, indeterminately early. So you could start the history, for example, of Chinese art, chapter 11. You could start it, if you're thinking chronologically, it would be before chapter 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It would be start way at the beginning of the book. But in order to gather the non-Western chapters, a number of compromises are necessary, and this is the first one. Stockstad has to start and restart these stories, sometimes from prehistory, in each of these chapters, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and then bring them up to an ending point that will be more or less where her chronology of Western art is. So she wants a kind of continuity, a kind of a timeline still, even though it has to have these flaws in it. Notice also that these chapters, 4 of the 5 of them anyway, end in the 13th and 14th century. She tries to find a kind of natural stopping place for these that's in the 13th or 14th century because she wants to take up and finish the narrative later in her book. So, for example, in chapter 10 on Art of South and Southeast Asia, ends before the rise of Islam, before the wide dissemination of Islam. Chapter 13, Art of the Americas, before 1300, includes the Maya and prepares the way for the Aztecs that are in the chapter that follows later in Stockstad's book. Then the book returns to Western art. From the early medieval art of Europe, that's chapter 15, through 17th century art in Europe, that's chapter 23. Notice that chapter 15, early medieval art in Europe, actually follows not from chapter 9, but from chapter 7, Jewish and early Christian art. Jewish and early Christian art leads naturally into early medieval art. They're both, there's geographic continuity and there's also cultural continuity. Again, Byzantine and Islamic are a little bit like interruptions there, even though they belong in the same chronology. And then it's time to return to non-Western art for the second time and the last time in this book. So these chapters, 24 through 29, that I've also marked in red, finish up the narratives in the earlier chapters, 10 through 14, and take them all the way up to the present. So the place where the chronology is stitched together, you might say, is right between chapter 23 and 24, where you're more or less sort of between 1300 and 1500. So you're not changing your chronology too much when you go from 23 to 24. But when you end chapter 24, you're in the present, because chapter 24 is Art of South and Southeast Asia after 1200. That is all the way to the present. Same thing with chapter 25. Chinese and Korean art after 1279 goes all the way to the present. So there is sort of a continuity in chronology between 23 and 24. And there's kind of a chronology, a continuity in the earlier block of non-Western ones between chapters 8, 9, and 10. But the rest of it is a bit of a mess because she has to take these non-Western cultures all the way to the present. So chapter 29, Arts of Africa from the 16th century to the present, if you were to read that chapter, you would get 4 centuries of material, 4 or 5 centuries of material, and you'd end at the present, but then if you turn the page to chapter 30, you'd be back in the 18th century. This makes for a very confusing table of contents, of course, and I don't think that many people see this. When you look at her table of contents, it's not even color-coded. I think it just looks like a sort of a list of cultures, something like that. But it has this important purpose because what she's trying to do is keep as much as she can of the master narrative of art, that is all the stuff that I put in black, which is essentially Gombrich's story of increasing naturalism. The non-Western material that's in red, some of those cultures, in part, they do have narratives, they do have stories. They're not increasing naturalism, but there are themes that carry through and make them kind of organic and connected and make them into stories, but not all of them. Some of them are just told as chronicles. A chronicle in historical writing means just a string of dates, times, places, and names, so sequences of cultures or dynasties, other political units, and kings and queens, and wars, and things like that. Those are chronicles. So they don't, in some places, the non-Western chapters, they don't have the kind of forward impetus that she worked so hard to keep in the three sections of Western art. So basically what's going on here is that she could have alternated many different times, black to red, black to red, black to red. But so the motivation for only alternating twice is to keep as much as possible of an echo or a remnant of that master narrative. I have a whole separate lecture on Helen Gardner. It's lecture 18, so I just have 3 screens on it here to make a point that's related and show that table of contents. Helen Gardner's maybe our most famous faculty member because she taught here and she wrote her book when she was teaching here. When it first appeared in 1926, Art Through the Ages was a pretty small book. You can get it out of the library and see for yourself. It got much larger. She expanded it twice, and there are posthumous editions. And sometime between 1994 and the present, it crossed the 50% threshold. It now commands 55 or 60% of the world market in art history textbooks. Outside the United States, it's hugely popular. I've seen copies in China, and I've had students from Taiwan, Laos, Thailand, Korea, Colombia, Sweden, Finland, Hungary, and Romania who all learned art history by reading Gardner. Her text has been pirated and illegally adopted and translated in an unknown number of countries. This is the cover of Edith Tamuri's textbook, History of Fine Arts in India and the West, that I talked about in lecture 19. And most of the part on the West actually comes from, is more or less stolen from, Gardner. The current editions are edited by this guy, Fred Kleiner, and they've become an amazingly large business venture, you might say. He says that each new edition costs $1.2 million in copyright fees. He writes a lot of the new entries himself, hundreds of them, and he also does 3D tours and videos for the book's website. It's a real one-man industry. Of course, he has lots of experts advising and contributing. So it's a massive enterprise now, a kind of corporate entity, you might say. So I just want to show a table of contents from a recent edition of Gardner. Gardner also interrupts the Western narrative, as you can see, and also interrupted twice, same as in Stockstad. The difference is that the second interruption is also the end of the book. So if you look on the right-hand part of the table of contents there, all the first entries, all in black, that representing European and American art. Chapter 30, the last of the chapters that I've said in black, Modernism and Postmodernism in Europe and America, 1945 to 1980, is almost the end of that sequence. And then there's a chapter 31, Contemporary Art Worldwide, which I put in red just because it's international contemporary art. But what's different here between this and Stockstad is that Gardner actually ends the last chapter in Africa, 1800 to 1980, which is gives the book a very different feeling than Stockstad. But it's the exact same rationale, that is to say, keep as much of the story, which actually has a continuous narrative, as possible by interrupting it a minimal number of times. So I want to give some examples of what it's like to read from one chapter to another in a book like Gardner or Stockstad. I'll take Stockstad here as my first example. They mostly do away with transitional passages, and so do these other large textbooks. So nothing links the chapters. There's no attempt to explain interruptions or recall themes that have been dropped dozens or hundreds of pages before. I'll give you an example of that. At the end of the chapter called Art of Africa in the Modern Era, you could read about an artist from the Ivory Coast named Ouattara Watts. quote, in his emphasis on the inherent spirituality of art, Stockstad and Cothran conclude, Ouattara voices what is most enduring about the African tradition. That's the last sentence of that chapter. And I have a little parenthesis here just because I found this fabulous picture of Watts with Basquiat that Stockstad and Cothran don't describe Watts's education in the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which is really interesting and significant for his perspective, or his interest in being considered, quote, just an artist and not an artist of color. And they also don't use him to summarize, quote, the African tradition, which is the theme of their chapter. So he doesn't exemplify or conclude the chapter, and he's not set in wider context. So that's just as a parenthesis. What I want to stress here is if you then turn the page from the sentence that I quoted, the very next page is this. You're now in the world of Western neoclassicism, and the chapter opens, this is the next sentence, for 2 centuries, the name Wedgwood has been synonymous with exquisitely made English ceramics. So this lack of a transition is, not surprising, of course, because usually books like these are assigned chapter by chapter. They're not books that you like take to the beach and read all the way through. They don't have that narrative drive. But it's not because it's absent. It's just because it's made difficult to follow by the amount of material and by the interruptions. Last topic here is this lack of judgment, the tone of the writing. Stockstad and Cothran write very carefully worded descriptions. They reserve judgment, and they try to be open-minded about everything. That's a quality that's intentionally avoided by Gombrich in The Story of Art. And it makes Stockstad and Cothran's book and the others seem enlightened and very just and multicultural, but also oddly purposeless, as if art history really had no story to tell, but it was just a chronicle, as I was defining it a few screens back. So I have a passage to show how that works has strengths and weaknesses. And this is from the end of the chapter, Art of the Americas After 1300. Quote, many Native American artists today are seeking to move beyond the occasionally self-conscious revival of traditional forms to a broader art that acknowledges and mediates among the complex cultural forces shaping their lives. That's quite a sentence, but just go on. One exemplar of this trend is Joan Quick-to-See Smith, who was raised on Flat Rock Reservation in Montana and traces her descent to the Salish of the Northwest Coast, the Shoshone of Southern California, and the Cree, a northern woodlands and plateau people. Wide swatches and rivulets of red, yellow, green, and white cascade over the newspaper collage, which you can see on the bottom. On a chain above the painting is a collection of both Native American cultural artifacts, tomahawks, beaded belts, feather headdresses, and American sports memorabilia for teams with names like the Atlanta Braves, the Washington Redskins, and the Cleveland Indians that many Native Americans find offensive. Surely, the painting suggests, Native Americans could trade these goods to retrieve their lost lands, just as European settlers traded trinkets with Native Americans to acquire the lands in the first place. What's interesting about this is that the writing here it's very accurate. It's very nicely pinned to the illustrations, and it does a good job of surveying most of the content of the text, and it even represents some of the purposes of it. But it has an amazing standoffishness and neutrality, given that what the subject here is a really passionate, politically engaged work with a polemical purpose. And it's a kind of work that would never have been initially described in that kind of language. Notice also, of course, that they don't draw any conclusions. It demonstrates, the quandaries that she faces, but no conclusions. So that passage was the end of the chapter, and just as another example of the lack of transitions, if you turn the page, you're in Easter Island. In the absence of critical judgments and advocacy and criticism and critique in general, all the art in these big textbooks is illuminated in a kind of dim light of uniform praise. In the absence of any meaningful sequence of periods, the art seems scattered as if all of art history were like an archaeological site that's strewn with random fragments. You really have to look, and you really have to read and with an eye to finding the narrative in order to see that it's there. In the absence, I think, of an author who's partisan to any particular period of style, because the authorial voice here, as they say, the voice of the narrator is not helping to guide you. In the absence of that kind of narrator, you may wonder if any art is better or more interesting than any other art. That's a very common thing in art history, and it's something that actually happens to art history teachers who teach world art, because in order to teach world art, you have to be sympathetic or empathetic to such a wide range of art that you actually can't start weighing and judging in the way that artists themselves always have. So it is possible to see the development of that tone if you compare earlier texts to more recent ones. And I'll give you an example of that from Gardner. There's a more recent edition there. But here's the first edition of Gardner. So from the first edition, here's a passage on Mayan art. This Mayan art is great art. There's a sentence you definitely won't find in any of your textbooks. It's the profound expression of a people who were overpowered by religious problems and practices, by the fundamental questions of man, nature, and God, and by the manifestation of these in ritual and gorgeous ceremony. At first sight, it appears fantastic and weird. See, she's talking like to, she's talking to kind of people that she's imagining, that is, say, people don't know Mayan art. At first sight, it appears fantastic and weird. For the subject matter, types, costumes, and apparent symbolism all seem so strange and unintelligible. Yet in many of the examples, there's an unmistakable expression of intense spirituality. So there's a really critically engaged and personal text. Now the fourth edition. So this was edited and changed after she died. Use of the word primitive need not imply crudity or lack of artistic quality. Works of art such as Benin bronzes from Africa or wood carvings from New Ireland, that's in the Pacific, are actually of complex design and high technical refinement. It has been said that primitive man generally has a feeling for rhythm in art superior to that of other peoples. Here's, of course, a sentence you absolutely could not write these days. Primitive man's attitude toward his technique is less intellectual than ours. His interests are narrower, his social patterns more fixed. Well, I mean, there's a ton wrong with that. The idea of the primitive itself has been critiqued many times, and the passage is gendered, and then the idea of this idea that rhythm is something that can be used as an attribute of quote unquote primitive people. But you can also at the same time seeing that it's becoming gradually less personal and less engaged, more abstract. And last, here's an excerpt from a recent edition. Native artists work almost by instinct in what we call abstract forms, non-objective, non-representational, stylized. Native art is overwhelmingly religious, and in religious art, as in religious rite, conventional forms, established from time immemorial, are conservatively retained with only slight change. Thus, we find little of the historical development of style in other native art that we have traced in the art of other periods. Very gray, very affectively, emotionally distant. So, by way of conclusion, this neutral tone definitely helps correct prejudices about other periods and cultures, but it also paints this emotionally uniform picture of artworks that were never actually, in their original contexts, the objects of dispassionate description. The neutral gray tone removes the impetus, removes the motive, the commitment, and the push that art has when it's recounted by people with a stake in its development. And that includes not only earlier writers like Gombrich, but also, obviously, artists themselves who are continuously and forever judging, weighing, and comparing, and hardly ever dispassionately chronicling.